All right, good morning still, everyone. I'm gonna call us together. 11:32, so let's convene I want to say that this afternoon, but it's not that way yet. So let's convene for the Opioid Settlement Fund Task Force this morning. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Chair Strips.
I'm here.
Chair Ray. Vice Chair Pro Tem Hepler. Commissioner Morales. Director Rutherford. Dr. Nettleton.
Present.
Director Bobo.
Present.
Sheriff Fuller.
Present.
Sarah Green. Director Darnell. Administrator Davis. Nicole Stortaboom.
Oh.
Dr. Ford. Present. Brenda Henry. Nancy King.
Present.
Dominic Gladstone.
Present.
April Anders. Right.
I'm here, Susan Davis.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Sorry about that. She did, but you were aside.
Present, clerk.
Yep, we know that. Thank you, Commissioner Morales. All right, so welcome to Director Darnell, Director of DEI for Kalamazoo County, joining us for their first session today. So welcome to you as we're nearing wrapping up our work here, but we welcome you in the dialogue. Sure. Request of a member. Would you please, take some time, briefly introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Del Darnell, as Chair said, new Director of DEI for the county. I have a background in nonprofit work coming from out front Kalamazoo, so was slightly involved in some of this work with my colleagues there. Looking forward to joining however I can and supporting the great work that you all have already done. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's Administrator Green. Welcome on in. Take your time. All right, so we have item number 3 is a review and approval of our prior meeting minutes. I would entertain a motion for the approval of the September 4th, 2024 Opioid Settlement Fund Task Force minutes.
Motion. Second.
All right, motion made by Sheriff Fuller, supported by Director Bobo. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approval say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. My computer's fussing around on me a second. All right, let's take us to item number 4, public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Opioid Settlement Fund Task Force on a topic. Members can present themselves to the podium if you're here in person, or certainly if we have anyone online. Do we have any members of the public that wish to address the body? Okay. Seeing none. Dina, is there anyone online with interest in comment?
Sure, there are no hands raised.
Thank you so much. All right, with that, we will close public comment and move to item 5 is our discussion. So we want to begin with a dialogue around funding recommendations. So we have a review of budget scenario 1 and a crosswalk with the opioid remediation exhibit E, and a review of granting timeline, which is quite complex in its nature. So I don't know, Deputy Administrator, would you like to provide some initial points to begin us off here? Not to rush you. Welcome, Director Rutherford.
Yes, so the first kind of outstanding item that we have is from our last conversation is looking at the annual budget that y'all have somewhat selected. We have had our finance accountant here. From our discussion, it sounded like there was more agreement around going with scenario one. So just want to walk through real fast that scenario one, which basically took what we were anticipating as our overall settlement dollars that we're going to get, dividing that evenly over the next 16 years, removing what has been allocated already from those internal departments, and then you will see what that annual remaining to allocate per year is. With that, we are carrying over a fund balance each year. However, that that is allowing for us to have that stability through the 16 years, to have that stable annual budget for those allocations. I think the discussion last time around is that, you know, there would be a value to have a level of stability with the funding versus some of the other scenarios y'all had looked at. One of the changes that we made, which allowed for that annual allocation to go up a little bit, and so I just want to be very clear of what that looks like. Initially, what we had done is we took over all the funding, and then we went ahead and removed $1 million and said, hey, we're going to set that aside for investment, because that had been a discussion that the task force had had regarding, do we set up some sort of investment funding so that way there's a longer term abilities with this funding. And talking with our financial accountant, I kind of looked at that a little bit closer and realized what we probably could do is go ahead and factor in that $1 million, not remove it off the top, but go ahead and factor it in. And then when we're looking at our estimated ending fund balance per year, that's actually the money that we would work with our treasurer to figure out how we invest that money. So that way it still allows us to have that investment and at what level y'all want that invested. But that we would be investing that actual fund balance that we're carrying over every year in order to have a stable budget, but then allows us to also have additional funding per year. So I'm hoping I'm describing that correctly, but that was one change that I wanted to note to y'all, in case you noticed that that investment funding had disappeared. The actual intent and thought behind that is that we would be looking at, for example, in 2025, that estimated ending fund balance is 3.8. We would be looking at investing a portion of that money, whatever portion it is that you're wanting to recommend to the board. And that is what would help us kind of carry that agenda item or that task forward as y'all have talked about. With that being said, so that's kind of point one. I want to pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions or concerns with that methodology.
Sheriff Fuller.
With regards to investing at any point, curious if we've seen other task force like ours do that. And, you know, specifically, I know that you can do this with the dollars given, but are we seeing anybody else's plans as to how they're going to do it? Or have we even thought have we looked at anybody else's ideas?
I don't know, but that's something I can definitely pose to our MAC consultant that we have, and they can probably give some thoughts to it. I have to imagine that other counties are considering that as an option. One question that is still outstanding that we just have to talk with our lawyer on is and making sure that we can invest those funds and that doesn't count towards our non-opioid remediation percentage that we have to keep in mind. So that's still kind of an outstanding thing that we're needing to narrow in on, but I think I'll refer to our MAC consultant and to pose those questions to her to see if she has any feedback. That's excellent.
Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to address that question also, and I think I was one of the folks, I don't remember exactly, there were more than one person, but brought this up about doing the investment. I believe the state of Michigan is doing that also with a portion of their funds statewide. So I don't know if any specific task forces, coalitions, or anything like that are doing it, but I had heard of this before. as Deputy Director Smith mentioned, the logistics are quite complicated, so they'll figure it out. But I do believe that the concept-wise, it's being done. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
So additional questions from me. I know, and Deputy Administrator, my apologies to you. I know this is an endlessly complex situation, but when we're really looking at the budget scenarios out over the term, you know, there really is only so much of the fund that we need liquid in which to accomplish the work if we set it out in the manner sort of delineated here. So while the strategy to take $1 million and invest it and use that interest income back into the opioid fund rather than, you know, I think it becomes an issue if we go to the general fund with earned interest, but we bring it back into the opioid fund. I would expect ultimately after we consult, it'll be okay. But I'm also wondering if we can be a bit more, I guess, aggressive in the strategy. I mean, $1 million is great, but if we really only need to see, you know, $950,000 liquid for fiscal 2025, do we have some short, medium, and long-term investments that can be made with the other resources that are at hand and let it grow? Because otherwise we're just holding it. And we do want to stretch that money out and be strategic, but the more that we can help it, you know, grow, the longer term impact that we're going to have. So I'd be interested in, you know, if there's some ways that we can evaluate. And I know that makes it more complex, and I'm sorry. So thank you.
No, I think that's fine. I think, and what I can, taking some notes here, and I think if that's the agreement of this task force is that y'all would like to see not just $1 million of that ending fund balance that we have, but maybe to the extent, to what extent would y'all like to see that invested? I think that that's something that we can incorporate into the report to the board. If it is it, we want to invest the full fund balance, we want to invest $3 million of the fund balance, whatever that dollar amount that this task force is wanting to recommend to the board, then at that point in time, those are then conversations to have with the treasurer as well, as far as what are those options. I think one thing that just dawned on me that maybe should be incorporated into the report that's not incorporated just yet, that draft report, is the assurance that not only that the funding is being invested, but that it's also being returned back to. And so I think that that is language missing that I'll make sure is added into.
Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you. Question, I'm going to ask a John Taylor question. What kind of a return can we expect, do you think, on investments that would be put into play if it was split and or combined or however you work it, but just a rough, I know you don't have exact numbers, but just a rough idea of what kind of return, let's say $1 million to make it an even number. What you invest $1 million, can you expect another $500,000 back in return, or what does that look like? I'm being optimistic with the economy.
If you're gonna channel Vice Chair Taylor, I will channel the energy of Deputy Treasurer Tyler and say if I knew that, I would not be in this job and I would be making millions of dollars. So I don't think that that is something that we can actually answer. And I don't think that our treasurer can actually answer that either. I think that we can look at what is at what's going on with the market, what they view, see the various options that they have, and bring that back forward after getting their insight. But unfortunately, I don't think that we can really estimate what that return will be and what the market will be doing.
Dr. Nettleton.
I guess my comment would be, I don't have enough expertise to make an informed decision. I don't know what the pros and cons of every approach is. I'm not sure if this task force has the expertise to make an informed decision about what the pros and cons of each approach. I think maybe what our role is big picture. We want to invest some, yes or no, and then we need expert advice about what the pros and cons are of each approach. I mean, that's my initial thought.
Thank you for that. And I'll just share within our budget process, I think we haven't, market volatility is a risk with investment. I think we are projecting a 8% return on investments this year. We're budgeting for 4. So, you try to be mindful and there's different investment categories. And we also have some investment we contract with some investment experts to help us with our tools. And maybe, just as a body, the dialogue from us is, whether or not we want to see it maximized as much as possible with as little risk. And then sort of, the board will make sort of budgetary decisions then. But Ms. King.
I think it'll also be helpful to know when we start seeing the grants coming in, how much money we're looking at from a grant perspective, and that might help to make some adjustments coming up as far as how much needs to be either invested or be available for grants.
Okay, I think that's helpful, and I think I have the language needed to incorporate in the report, and also the action items of talking with the treasurer, and then also our MAC consultant for just research on what other counties are doing. So with that, then looking at our annual budgets that we've set forward. So again, it's broken down by calendar year. It does run into 3 pages, but you will see on here the annual amount that we're allocating is, I'm gonna just round, as $953,000. Again, this is to spread out all of the funding over the 16 years. And then we've subtracted out those internal department requests, assuming all that their budgets are utilized and that they aren't returning any of the funding back to the opioid settlement dollars. Then you're roughly looking at around $625,000 for 2025, 2026, 27, 28. Those numbers kind of start dipping a little bit. In part, that's because right now we have anticipated a 4% for that reoccurring funding, a 4% change because those are position related. And we just know that based off of the decisions, there's some variables there, but based off of the decisions of the board of steps that they take for those, what they're going to allow for step increases or that cost of living adjustment. So we've just kind of conservatively said 4%, but know that that's a variable that could continue to change from year to year. That is why you're seeing what is the annual allocation available. That's why you're seeing that dip down a little bit each year. Regardless, what we're looking at, and we can just kind of, for purposes of dialogue and conversation, we're looking at about $600,000 per year of unallocated funds from our budget that we can utilize for granting out opportunities. From our last conversations that we've had, I've included in right after those pages the crosswalk from settlement priorities within Exhibit E. So I've taken what y'all have talked about as far as the different priority categories and crosswalk that to how that is in alignment with Exhibit E. The blue font is the core abatement strategies, and the black font is additional approved uses that are within Schedule B. But that kind of gives you that visual aid there of what priority areas align with those priority categories. I think one thing that I heard from the last meeting was a decision of, out of that 600,000, where are we putting the priority? When we do release grants, sometimes we do leave it open-ended, or sometimes we do say, you know what, we want to allocate this percentage, this funding category, this percentage to this funding category, and some decisions are made based off of what is needed in the community, whether that is from the work that this task force is doing or that needs assessment. In housing millage, is looking at the housing plan study that was done. So I think that's where the discussion is now of that $600,000. And again, rounding for purposes of discussion, how do y'all want to move forward with those granting opportunities as it relates to these priority categories. And also how it relates to, which is a little bit farther down, how it relates to mini grants, larger grants, quarterly, biannually, things like that. So really big discussion today.
I just have one additional question on the budget projections. That does not, it doesn't include return on investment projections yet. Okay. And so I think what's important to keep in mind that sort of $600,000 is, you know, it may not grow a lot, but it is the floor of what we'll have to invest with Hope. So hopefully we'll have maybe a bit more. Go on.
Yes, and also this is also only the agreements that we have that are fully executed. So we have about 8 different agreements now that we have fully executed, and that we know what those settlement dollars are and roughly what that payment schedule is going to be. There are other settlement agreements that are still out there and pending too. I think it's roughly, if I said 8, probably about 5 that we know of right now. So again, we're just using this as projections for right now, but a year or 2 from now, this number could look a little different.
Thank you, Ms. King.
Do we have written anywhere what those prior agreements already are? Is that anywhere put out there as far as the amounts, what they are?
Yes, I can get that are you wanting the total amount per year from all of those settlement agreements, or what are you looking for exactly?
What that's being allocated to?
Oh, what it's being allocated?
Yeah, so looking at, yes, yep, exactly.
Oh, the
So-
standing items.
Yes.
Yeah, I can speak to those very briefly. One is the health educator position within the health department. One is a jail nurse position focused on MAT related services. The next item is within the Office of Community Corrections. And then those are the 3 reoccurring that we have. There were 2 others that are no longer reoccurring. One was for kind of administratively things that we needed for the community needs assessment and like website updates and things like that. That was very minimal. And the other one was some jail equipment that was purchased. That was a one-time purchase.
I think that's really important because of when we talk about the transparency, having that information available. So it is going to appropriate resources as far as really focusing on what we're trying to do here versus, you know, a lot of miscellaneous type of things that aren't necessarily related. So I think that was very helpful.
And that it is on our website. So when you go to calcounty.com, click on opioid settlements. When you scroll down underneath the financial report, we do have a spending plan per fiscal year. That's a best practice that MAC suggests that we do. So there's a spending plan per year that talks about one-time costs, ongoing costs, and then what the expenditures are and the usage of that funding that we do 100% plan to continue to do.
So just to clarify, question from, we haven't moved on to sort of the grant cycle document. Ms. King was asking about the sort of recurring funding streams within the proposed potential budget and just what they were. And then there's a public facing document that Deputy Administrator elevated for us. Sheriff.
I didn't see it in my packet. Yeah, the only thing I want to remind everybody is that equipment that was purchased for the jail's use, that in 3, 5, or 6, and I don't remember, we'll have a re-up agreement for the maintenance of those pieces of equipment. And I think that figure is already reflected early on in the first dollar spent.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll have some future discussion about how to best resource that. Okay, so Deputy Administrator, thank you so much again for all that. So what next do you want to kind of glean from the body here?
Yeah, so I think today walking away from what this body would like to do, again, knowing roughly rounding, we have 600,000 to grant out. There's been lots of discussion about having mini grants, of having larger grants, of having quarterly cycles, of having twice a year cycles, needing to have a direction on how y'all would like to proceed with that, what that timeline looks like. I believe the Board of Commissioners, as part of that draft report, is looking for what that timeline looks like, what that frequency looks like. And if you also choose to, with other millages, we generally have funding categories that the board then approves and says, yes, we'd like to have X amount of dollars or percentage of dollars go to this funding category, this funding category, this funding category. Is that something that y'all would like to also include in your report? And if so, looking at that crosswalk to see what funding categories based off of the needs assessment and the dialogue here would you like to be proposing to the Board of Commissioners?
So let's hone in on that first before we begin sort of talking about timelines or types of grant cycles. So I want to encourage us. I mean, we know all of the needs are needed. You know, we need to address it in all of the approaches that we can, right? But also this task force, if we do not elevate some priorities, then what we're doing then is leaving the prioritizing to the board that maybe does not have the same insight or expertise, or as maybe we consider approaches and we have a third party, like how the Community Foundation is organizing mini grants, then that body is going to be the one to prioritize. So I really want to hear from us. And I like Deputy Administrator's illustration, similar to what we do in the housing millage. So we have a rough estimate of funds. We know those might increase. We have additional settlements. We have some investments. So maybe we can try to identify priority areas and some suggestions about the percentage potentially that we'd like to see sort of focused in those areas. And that'll give some flexibility, but also some guide rails using our perspective to help inform the board. So as we ponder that, we can have some dialogue. Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And that was very insightful that the board, we were reminded that the board is asking us to kind of give them some advice. So I think some priority areas are important. I do have one quick question before we get too far down any rabbit holes. And that is, how are we doing right now as far as the cycle for the Kalamazoo Foundation is getting grant applications? Is it closed out, and where are we at? Or is that that's covered later? Then disregard, Your Honor. I'll move on. So housing has been a big one. What can we do to help people with some sort of transitional housing? I just throw that out as a priority item. Housing has been a big one. It's come up more than once in more than one discussion and more than one committee that I sit on. How do you have people leave a jail or a treatment center and go back to an unstable environment? So housing would be one to throw on the table. And I'm not throwing these out in any priority order, but that would be one that's a big one. Also, how can we improve warm handoffs, which is not necessarily something that costs us money, but it's something to think about for everybody as we publish information. Warm handoffs are better than somebody walking out of someplace with no resources, nowhere to go. So that would be up for discussion. But I throw the housing out there first. I'll come back to others perhaps later, but we could talk about that as a priority item.
On that particular topic around housing, I agree. It is something consistently heard in the dialogue, and I've elevated this a couple times, and I don't know where the task force is about it. But we also have some substantial housing millage resources, and I wonder, as we identify prioritization with these dollars, if we want to consider within our recommendation back to the board that when they're looking at housing millage applications, that they elevate and prioritize any that have treatment or transitional focus that relates to opioids, so that when we see applications come through the housing millage, those get amplified and they're more likely to receive housing millage funds than maybe something that doesn't address that need in the community. So thoughts on that? Is that something that we are, not that we can't use some of these resources, but is that something we think we should elevate to the board to give strong consideration for the housing millage with as well?
And when you're referencing that, you are talking about programming, not just the physical structure.
It can be
Okay.
either or.
Yeah.
It could be construction of a physical structure or supportive services. Yeah. Both are funded through the housing millage. Mr. Gladstone.
I wonder if it wouldn't be worth having Chris Pompey talk for, at some point at our next meeting or something. Maybe he could give a 5 or 10 minute description. I know I've had conversations with him in the past, and he said there's quite a bit of hurdles to get over, but we didn't get into the specifics of what those were to open a recovery house. But I know it's been said more than once, Pam Coffey, Chris Pompey, others, Brenda Henry, who's not here today, but maybe somebody like Chris could just say, would you describe all of the hurdles you had to go through so that we have an understanding and make a recommendation? Because might not all just be the money allocation. It might be the Board of Commissioners and the city commissioners need to get together and adjust zoning or something like that. I'm not knowledgeable enough to know, but I know that there's some other hurdles to jump through, and maybe we need to look at those instead of just putting a Band-Aid on, look at healing the entire process. It might be worth hearing it from Chris Pompey.
Commissioner Morales.
Thank you, Chair. That's a great idea. We also already have structures in place to help support things like this. So when we think about returning citizens, how we already have like a task force of folks that are there, Michigan Works, some of our hospitals and community colleges and things like that. So if we can kind of mimic that, I think if we have this structure to have all of that housed in there and maybe adopt what ISK has down the street, but in a place where someone can stay more than 3 days. I think if we really plan this out, that it could be a good transition. I am highly for strong handoffs, not a warm handoff, a strong handoff so that we ensure that that person does not have we can kind of omit them going back to the same environment. So we need to think about, what does that stay look like? How much is it per person? And then what that looks like getting them back into the community. So maybe pulling in different housing entities to get them vouchers and things like that. So Chair is right. When it comes back to our board, you got 9 different ideas that could come out and be drawn out. So I would really encourage all of you. I mean, I know today we're on a spot, but as we move forward for our next meeting or via email with Deputy Administrator, so that we can think about this and then come back and have a good strategy so that when we get in the board meeting, if there's questions, Chair or myself can hurry up and answer them. Not hurry up, but we can answer them so it's not long and drawn out and folks feel like, no, we already have resources for that. Why are we building this? We get a lot of that, those questions around duplicative efforts. And I don't want that to happen in this conversation with all the hard work that we're doing. Thank you, Chair.
I think, thank you, Commissioner Morales. Recovery housing, you've person maybe coming out of, say, inpatient treatment facility and moving out of, they're not ready to go home yet because there's too much in the environment, risk and the social framework around them. So recovery housing now, we have limited slots and people typically go there for about 90 days, and 90 days is not long enough for some people, nor is even a spot available for 90 days for some people. And master leasing is another tool that is utilized in ISK and their housing division for some of folks that are also getting other programs and services. Maybe that's also another tool for us to sort of explore and discuss. I see Dr. Nettleton, please.
I just had a comment about the housing discussion and then a proposal for distribution. Housing is expensive. There's no way around that. I know there's multiple initiatives in the community that's addressing housing. So I think maybe strategically pointing those initiatives to highlight those for those who have substance use disorders and affected families may be a strategy, and to use these funds specifically in a different direction. That's the comment I have about that. But what I propose to your question, Chair, is about breaking down numbers and proportions to help guide the commissioners is treatment, and this is aligning with also our KCOC, the Kalamazoo County Opioid Coalition. So I propose an allocation of 50% for treatment, which includes access to treatment, which is an emphasis on transportation that comes up multiple times in our coalition. 20% for prevention, which includes an emphasis on families and also stigma reduction. 20% for harm reduction, which includes syringe services programs, and 10% for recovery efforts, including an emphasis on handoffs. I propose that given that the needs in the community that keep on being articulated, and that these percentages can also can change over time. Perhaps as we move forward, more of an emphasis on prevention in years later. I think about where we're at right now as kind of being in a hole, right? We've had this cohort, particularly amongst people who are age 30, 50 years old, who continue to use and continue to die in our community. And that cohort really needs emphasis on harm reduction and treatment. As that cohort moves on in ages and perhaps gets to a place of recovery, and then a re-emphasis on prevention as a longer term strategy. So that's what I propose for the board and for this task force.
Thank you so much, elevating the work of the KCOC to the, if I'm using the acronym correctly, that work of the coalition is ongoing and so valuable to this community. And thank you for your efforts, and many of you here on that. Sheriff Fuller.
Sorry to keep coming back to the well. So, one of the things that I've looked at in the past, and one of the things I hope we can consider at this task force level, is the county already has a homeless or underhoused population millage. It's a 0.75 mils, and it raises a good number of dollars for this county every year to use in these areas. And one of the things that I was impressed with last night was the board's moving forward with the 5.2, I think it is, on Cork Street for the 60 units there. That's awesome. It's going to be a huge help. But one of the things that I wonder we could use any of the housing millage in conjunction with our opioid dollars as partners to have some sort of recovery level. Maybe it's a 4-bedroom apartment type situation for a recovery house that we could work with the land bank to find the right house. So something I'd like to put on people's minds right now.
Yeah, thank you, elevating that potential land bank partnership. That's another good idea to lift forward. Do we have any additional feedback for some of the percentages that Dr. Nettleton has elevated as well? Do we feel fairly comfortable gleaning from that? Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Ford.
Yeah, I support Dr. Nettleton's percentages, specifically because when we look at this funding, all of the guidance is that we should be using it for evidence-based treatments. And one thing that's very evidence-based are the medications for treatment and also harm reduction. I mean, there's lots of research that show those programs work. So if we could, I know like 50% seems like a large percentage, but the thing about treatment is that it integrates with every other aspect of what we're doing here. And it's under integrated currently. Medications for addiction treatment are underutilized, and even in the recovery space. But when we're talking about supportive housing, recovery, integrating those connections for handoff for medications with treatment and continuous care while they're living in recovery housing and supporting one another. So I support the percentages as Dr. Nettleton laid out. And I think it is true that it will be something that it can shift as we move forward over the years.
Commissioner Morales.
Thank you, Chair. So with that, Dr. Nettleton broke off these percentages, I think it's important to do the same as we figure out what the treatment process looks like. I don't know what that looks like from a citizen's perspective when someone gets released? Is it 60, 90 days? I know people have different recovery cycles. So I think it'll be important for us to put in place that handoff from when they're released to when they're actually in the housing unit, and what those 6, 8 weeks, 1 year, is it a whole year that they're there, what that looks like. And I don't know if it's a contractual agreement with the housing and the person in recovery to follow these steps and meet with who they need to meet with, get on track, bank accounts, so that when they are done and they successfully complete the program, that we do put them in a position where they're working and they're stable. Because even after a year, you can be somewhere and get comfortable. And then if you don't have a plan afterwards, you can revisit, what you previously did. So again, when we think about what these steps look like, I would like it to be that same process of how we're dealing with these percentages. So it makes it easier for us to make a decision as a board, but also whoever we employ in these spaces have a clear strategic plan to move through as we move forward.
I'm gonna go to Director Rutherford, as he hasn't had to chime in yet, and then Ms. King and Mr. Gladstone.
I too support Dr. Nettleton's percentage proposal because I think it will keep us on point, and it's important beyond that to drill down even further, so that when you identify these are the 4 or 5 areas that we want to focus on, and this is the emphasis within each of those areas, you need to think about, okay, what do you want to do with that 50%, and be a little bit more precise, so that when you send out RFPs or however the process works, that you're addressing specifically the areas within, because within that 50%, there's a lot of work that can be done, and where do you want to focus that emphasis? I also like the idea of just being open-minded about varying that on an annual basis or whatever regular time frame you want to impose, because I think that if we're doing our job right, then hopefully we improve in certain areas, but it gives us the opportunity to reallocate, again, if it's annually. But I appreciate the emphasis on, hey, here's the compartments that we want to be working on, just encouraging us to really dig into what kind of work do you want done within those respective compartments.
Ms. King.
So I also agree. I think that there's, we may see what grant applications come in as to how that might adjust, because we might have this big chunk up there and it's not really what people are requesting or needing or showing a value for right now in our community. Second of all, with the housing, I think it is critical that with that housing piece, that they're getting the ability to leave that housing and be successful. Too often people leave. The other thing we have to look at is those resources that are helping to get people into those housing. A lot of times they don't ask the right questions. Do you have a place to go? Yes. Well, what does that place look like? It's like, I had this recently where somebody goes, yeah, I'm going back to my house. Well, who lives with you? My dad. Well, what does your dad do? Well, he's in active use. So I think that that's a piece that I know, working with people, that they're not necessarily asking the right questions to really get the details to help that person, because there's safety in chaos. They go back to that environment, they know what to expect from that environment. Going to a place where I'm going to be living with other people I don't know is scary. And that transition information is what's going to make somebody successful in making a choice to spend some time in transitional housing before maybe returning to an environment. Another issue we have to look at too is individuals who are not single, that they have an individual who they're either married, or maybe even it's a father with a child who has the responsibility of the child. We don't have men's housing with children at all. And we only have one women's housing with children. And so that it's a big thing to look at in terms of that broader picture of families and what that looks like.
Thank you for elevating that with families. Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With my ADHD, the longer you wait to get to me, the more topics I start to come up with that I want to share, just for the record. I agree with Dr. Nettleton, and I'm active with the coalition as well. And I think they do a lot of great work in figuring out the stuff. So that's an easy one. I'm in agreement. And I also want to emphasize something that Doc said, which was it's a moving target at times, you know, what we've got now versus what's coming up. And we need to be able to have some flexibility with the board to be able to pivot and shift gears when necessary. That's something I've noticed in government over the years. We get down a path and it's like a very large ship moving along, and it's real tough to turn like a speedboat. So we need to think of ways that maybe this task force could contribute ongoing we switch to quarterly meetings to review, or at least meet twice a year at some point, that we review things and say, hey, we've got some new hot topics. I know Nancy is always teaching me new things, you know, and I hear stuff from other people that work in the business. So the target does move. I'll throw this out there. Families in recovery do have a shortage. I had to send a mother, father, and child to Grand Rapids to get help. Now, you haven't got the wherewithal to get help here because you're poor or struggling, and you're standing at, you know, well, they're not a payphone, but we don't have those anymore, but you're standing on the street, and I have to send them to Grand Rapids, and how are they going to get there? I just saw an article about something with families in recovery. The Holiday Inn in Kalamazoo is getting converted to families in recovery place. Is that what I heard correctly? I am seeing people nodding.
It's a shelter for unhoused families.
Shelter for unhoused families. So it's not specific to recovery, but finally a place
Likely
where,
a lot of overlap though.
but finally a mother, father, and child, or a single mom or a single dad or whatever can get help. So that's good. Here's something I'd throw out is job training. Organizations that work with people that could help train them, the folks that, you know, you get through treatment, you're stabilized. Now they want you to go back to where you need to live. So we're talking about housing. You get a stable house. Next thing on the list is I need to find an employment that can pay the bills. And a lot of times people need further training. So maybe some innovation in the areas of job training. So one of these organizations comes up with a program that'll help there. I don't have the answers, but that would be something I'd throw out on a grant request. Hey, rack your brain and think outside the box. Sorry to sound cliche, but, you know, come up with some new ideas of how we can help people get better jobs. Because, you know, Taco Bell for $8 an hour versus, you know, drug sales, big difference in how much money you make. So we need to get people making better salaries, a living wage. Thanks.
Ms. Davis, thank you.
Thank you. I feel like I need to do a little summary. So we started out talking about the housing and for commissioners to be able to make a recommendation to the county commission related to use of millage funds for housing and how do we incorporate this work. So it sounds like that's something that we're being asked to encourage, support, and a lot of really good conversation when it comes to, we do need to focus on those families and keeping them together. There's a huge emphasis in our state on maintaining families. There's a lot of really good prevention programs out there to support the family in all aspects of their life. And then I also support the percentage that we've talked about as far as looking at that. And just because maybe we focus on, you know, some of the millage funds for housing doesn't prevent somebody from making a grant proposal that would also include some housing opportunities and options. So I just wanted to kind of do a little summary and circle. If we're looking for a recommendation related to housing and the millage funds, is that something that we need to do today?
Well, as we're having the dialogue, Deputy Administrator is compiling sort of our recommendation report. We have a draft we're going to have some discussion on tonight or this afternoon. Some of the, I won't keep us that long, I'm sorry. Don't throw anything at me. But you know, our discussion today will end up, you know, within that draft too. So as we want to refine or add detail to it, we certainly will be able to do it. I think Mr. Gladstone elevated something that I would have as well. You know, if we're talking about the need over time as conditions change in the community to adjust our percentages, is there value in this body or another mechanism like the Opioid Coalition weighing in on some sort of a schedule back to the board with recommendations about, hey, here's where we started, we've seen conditions change, here's what we would recommend the focus be on the next, in your next year of, you know, maybe this body convenes biannually or annually, or we seek guidance from the Opioid Coalition. Director Rutherford.
So I appreciate that being brought up as well, because as we get closer to the sunset of our task with this respective committee, I just want to remind, you know, this group of, you know, the value of the other coalition that has been in existence now for going on 7 years. And, you know, the makeup of that group is really the boots on the ground. And I think that there could potentially be some evolution from the work that we're doing to what you want that committee to put on their plate. And I think that you've got a lot of skill set there and a lot of great leadership. And with Kendall's, you know, involvement, the organization is really gelled. So I think that they're up for a task of transition and again, the evolution of where do you want them to be? And you know, we're ahead of the curve as it relates to a body like that or a committee like that. Most counties, and particularly in Michigan, they just didn't have that. So we came out of the gate with 6-7 years of experience that was put into that work group. So I encourage us to really look at that coalition and determine, you know, where do we want to go with that. You know, I'm not saying that you abandon this group altogether, but I think that, you know, they can do a lot of what we need to have done moving forward as it relates to advisory roles for the commissioners to make decisions on funding.
Thank you. And I think one of the, and I agree, I mean, it's amazing that we have the work of that body in the community. One of the struggles and how we end up sort of convening this task force is that need for that like publicly facing noticed meeting with quorums. If it ends up a formal advisory body, then we're going to need to sort through like how the we'll add it to what's it called, Schedule B that we were looking at. Or you know, they because what I like for them is that they have the ability to just have an open dialogue together, you know, and it's not as constrained as sort of the process we get imposed here. But that doesn't preclude them from, you know, having a lead of the coalition come and do an annual presentation to our board and have some, you know, recommendations that they make rather than sort of tagging them as a formal advisory body. But Deputy Administrator.
Yeah, I was just going to add, and again, happy to do a little bit more research on this, but I believe other counties do have a coalition, maybe not one as strongly established as ours, but for instance, with my talks with my counterpart up in Kent County, I believe what the Kent County Board of Commissioners have done is instead of forming a task force like we did here, they are getting advisement from that community coalition and helping bringing forward whether that is a report or this is what we see or what the need is. So I think that there is a model to potentially allow that community coalition to exist in a way that's been organic and allows for that open dialogue and strategy, as well as folding it into what the Board of Commissioners needs to see as far as, and what our community wants to see as far as public meetings, knowing what's happening in full transparency of how decisions are being made. So I'm happy to do a little bit more research on that. But I think that there is a way to maybe kind of have those things come together a little bit more without maybe necessarily creating another advisory body, but that also is something we can always do as well.
Deputy, I giggle because we work on seating all these advisory bodies we have, and that's quite a challenge, Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. One thing I don't want to have happen, and I don't think any of us want this to happen, is that the Board of Commissioners is in the middle of a meeting and trying to make a decision, and we don't have somebody in the room that could potentially step up to the mic, maybe a little latitude, like can we hear from some of our task force members or coalition members on the spot while it's being discussed on the floor? I don't know how that works into your open meeting laws and structure, but to have the board be able to have some input and info on an ongoing basis so that as these things come up, they're not having a blind discussion. So whatever, just to dovetail on the end of that commentary, that they're not left in the dark, because as you said, I know most of the board members, they're not experts in healthcare. Thanks.
So I'll go to Commissioner Morales in just a moment. I just want to draw our attention to our time. I want to be able to have some discussion around that sort of grant cycle process and sort of bring this portion of the discussion to an end here. But Commissioner Morales.
Thank you, Chair. So to answer your question, there's always room on our agenda, which I'm talking to the jail. I looked at sheriff, the jail, talk to the jail. You can talk to our chair, Ray, and our administrator, and we can always have a presentation before it's discussed on the agenda. And then if you see it on the agenda, you can always come through public comment time. And so we won't be totally blind to the facts. So there will be opportunities for this to be expressed before decisions are made.
All right, so before I put us forward, Deputy Administrator, you feel like you've gleaned clear consensus from the dialogue we've had here around prioritization. So let's now talk through the mini grant cycle and biannual large grant cycle document provided to us. I know, right? So and let's try to read all the detail in that out fast as well. So Deputy Administrator, thank you for the effort on doing that. So I think we all can see just from a cursory view what we've sort of discussed as a group with mini and large grant cycles, and quarterly awarding and annual awarding becomes inextricably complex, right? And so we also have to be mindful, the more we sort of bog it down with administrative process, the more siphoning of resources we have away from where we need to focus. One thing I'll sort of put into the ether for us to consider, we're doing a mini grant process right now through a community foundation. So maybe there's a consideration, this body says, let's take some amount of money, and we do want those to go out to mini grants, and let's contract with somebody to work that process. And maybe we do that with all of the process, or maybe we consider a less frequent large grant cycle that comes through our county process, just as a first spitball idea. All right, open to any other thoughts as we all sort of digest a bit.
But maybe we could get Deputy Smith to just explain a little bit of this to us, because the font size is
yes,
beyond the reach of progressive lenses.
Deputy Smith, would you please give us a bit of an overview? Thank
yes,
you.
and I apologize. I created this in many different ways to try to showcase what it would look like at the bare bones. So essentially it's color coded. If we look at the grant timeline example 1, if we're doing quarterly rolling grant cycles, those are color coded. Quarter 1 would be red, 2 is purple, 3 is green, 4 is blue. And then the other discussion was to have those larger grant cycles be offered twice a year. The first one's in black. The next one is in a kind of a brown orange. With all of that, yeah, and I do realize having color coding is also not really accessible. And so again, I apologize for that too. But with that, you know, we'll take Q1, and I know we're in the middle of 2024, but this is just to kind of give an idea of what that looks like. You know, if you wanted Q1 funding to begin January 1 at the beginning of that quarter, what were the steps, the back steps that have to occur? This is factoring in 1 month of prep, whether that is the budget, the application, communications to the board or to the public about the upcoming opportunity. And then, of course, the board's approval of moving forward. Again, that some of that could be done for all quarterly grants in one little lump sum, but essentially giving 1 month of staff prep. Then you have 1 month of a grant application being open, so allowing the community to apply for funding. Then you have 1 month to allow for the reviewing and scoring of those applications and making those funding decisions. And then you have 1 month available to presenting that to the Board of Commissioners, allowing them to provide input and or changes, and then entering into contracts and executing the contractual agreement that is required. And then the funding can begin. So with anything that we do, the minimum of leading up to funding beginning, there's a 4-month process that exists. And so what I tried to showcase is the amount that would be required every single time a quarter opened, or anytime the portal quote unquote opened for people to apply. There is, even if there's not the application we have to prep the community and to allow them to know this funding is available. And the other things, the opening, closing, reviewing and scoring, and then the Board of Commissioners component of it, those are real things that need to take at least those 3 months for that transparent process. So example 1 was my attempt to try to condense this how I could best condense it, trying to leave it on 1 page so you could just kind of quickly see that snapshot of administratively what we would be looking at, especially as we get into 2025 and we have this happening every single year. Once you get into 2026, the complexity that's going to be existing with this type of system in place. We're going to be in a continual process of opening, closing, and that could be something that the community needs, but that could also be a confusing process of how the community could engage with us. So that's really what example 1 is showing you. If you move into example 2, that was my attempt to try to simplify it a little bit by allowing 2 mini grant cycles. So moving from quarterly, moving that to just twice a year, and allowing just for 1 larger grant cycle to open close. It still gets pretty complex as you look at year 26. So as we really start this going, and that's going to continue to build as we move through all the years. But it is a little bit more simplistic than what the first example is. And lastly, I didn't include this in there, but just to give you, I just want to make sure that y'all are aware of just the current processes that we have. So housing millage, which allocates about $8 million a year. We have 1 opportunity where the portal opens and the portal closes, and we go through a similar process that's outlined here. For the senior millage, that is about $2 million a year. The proposal they just put forward and what they're in the middle of doing is actually a funding cycle that's a 3-year funding cycle, as well as they'll have some of their funding categories that are just going to be on an annual basis. But again, that portal opens once a year and closes once a year, and that's presented to the board in that manner. What's not included, because I did originally include this, if you can imagine, it was a little bit more complex. I did originally include the reporting, because I think that's something that I'm hearing overwhelmingly from the task force and the community and the Board of Commissioners, is to have the reporting component of that. So what's not included in here is then the additional administrative need of working with those that have been contracted with to process their financials, so get them paid, as well as get their reporting that they have, that they can show what their funding has been doing for the community. So allowing for quarterly reports, if that's what you also wish, or whatever that is, but that reporting mechanism, both for financial and programmatic needs, for then us to also then communicate that up to the board and to the community on the website. That actually is not included in here, but would be 2 additional steps that would need to be happening with every single grant cycle as well that y'all choose to have.
Yikes. Thank you, Deputy Administrator. Just let me tell you again how appreciated you are for all the efforts, really. Thank you so much. So, you know, we hear the complexity here. So what do we have, some thoughts, Director Bobo, and then I'll go to Dr. Nelson.
Wow. I think your example number 1, there is no downtime. I mean, it's too complicated, too burdensome. And that originally it was kind of like, let's have these broken down so there's not so much uptime. They're always up. So I would not support something that requires so much intensive, time consuming, all year long effort.
Thank you, Director. Dr. Nelson.
Yeah, I think I would just emphasize that we want to be effective. And I think probably here less is more. And what the one question I have is about yearly versus every 3-year grants, and how that would work. Does that mean a portal, like if we do a 3-year grant, does that mean that every 3 years it's upped, or is it every annually it's reviewed? That's a question I have. But in general, I'd say less is more, and I would propose simple is better. Maybe even 1 large grant a year and 1 mini grant application a year, separated by 6 months.
Ms. King.
I do like the example 2 better, as far as small nonprofits having annual reports versus quarterly reports is very beneficial in not overburdening, the information, the data, as well as the overall effectiveness of the grant. It isn't necessarily reflected in a quarterly report. I do like the 2 mini grants. I know that sometimes when you apply for a grant, a lot of the mini grants, we don't know what those, we haven't put dollar amounts on what those look like, but you apply for a grant and it's like, but if that grant doesn't come through, then what do I do? That gives a little bit more opportunity to say, oh, I have another opportunity of funding resources, versus writing a bunch of grants and then you're going, oh, I got them all, now I have to turn down grants. So there are challenges on both sides. But I think I agree. I think less is more in terms of the plan.
Director Rutherford and then Mr. Gladstone.
So I appreciate the illumination that this breakdown provides, because I think it really lends itself to the reality of the more complex something is, the more administrative involvement there needs to be. And if the goal objectively is to try to use as much of this resource on the ground as possible, the more complexity that you create with the administration of the funds, and don't forget, someone needs to review those quarterly, those annual reports. Somebody needs to really step back and be responsible for, is that organization, is that entity doing what they said that they were going to do, so that there's checks and balances along the way. Again, if you overload complexity and responsibility, ultimately what in a deputy county administrator, that can't be her job. She's already got a PD and this is not on it. So eventually they're going to come back and say, We need FTEs for this. So you dilute the availability of resource when you start loading responsibility because somebody's got to do it. So I again support less is better.
Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you. I also agree that less is more. While I appreciated your detailed explanation of scenario one, I was overwhelmed by the amount of work that had to be done at all these steps. So going back to something I said, I don't know how many meetings ago, and I've said it more than once, we want to try to provide some low barrier funding for smaller nonprofits that don't have a director of development or somebody who's a permanent grant writer on staff. If you're going to do that, you can't throw a complex system out there that's going to throw a monkey wrench at them and expect them to say this is low barrier. To that statement, the reporting had best be relatively simple reporting as well. I mentioned in a previous meeting, trust-based philanthropy principles where you make some of the reporting perhaps conversational. That could still be typed, but it could be somewhat more conversational than what I see with a SAMHSA grant that's as thick as an old phone book. So we want to keep the reporting simple, straightforward. Yes, there should be reporting. You don't want to just give money without an answer back, but let's figure out how to keep that simple. Let's make sure we keep in mind low barrier, so the process being simple. And also, yes, the administrative burden is huge. If you, I mean, we got nonprofits in the room, 4 cycles a year. I agree though with Nancy. Sometimes you miss a grant cycle and you're like, I can't get my idea off the ground for another year until the cycle opens up. So we have to meet in the middle somewhere. So all those factors need to come into play when we're making this recommendation. Thank you.
Director Darnell.
I actually plan to say almost the same things Mr. Gladstone did, so thank you. First of all, just thank you, Deputy Administrator. I think that after you walked us through, I thought it was a pretty genius way of outlining that information and shows us visually how much burden there is. And so I thought it was great. Which brought me to the second point. Also, I was going to raise up trust-based philanthropy and looking at how can we reduce the burden of whoever is reviewing these, as well as making these funds more equitable and accessible for smaller nonprofits. And if we've already partnered with the Community Foundation, 100%, I think they switched about 5 years ago, 100% of their funding is done through trust-based philanthropy. And so we've already signed off on that partnership. And I'm sure that they would help model that for us and for whoever's reviewing these grants. And so I agree with you. I think that it would be a great way to hit all those things that we're trying to hit. Most saliently, making these funds easy to access and more equitable to access for smaller nonprofits. Thank you.
One of the things on that point, I'll come to Administrator Green and then Ms. King. We're talking about the 1 to 3 year cycle. One of the benefits of the longer, I mean, there's downsides to it as well. But as we're launching a new initiative within a nonprofit, you have to staff up, you have to, develop, you have to communicate. That takes time just to get the launch to occur, and you're already near the end of the year. And so, maybe a recommendation that we leave that request to applicants, so they could request from us 1 to 3 year funding. We can then make a determination, do they get 3 year award, or we're not sure if this is something that we see as going to have enough impact. So maybe we're going to award just a year of the funding, or let's do 2 of the years. So maybe we leave that sort of open instead of committing to one or the other. Just a thought that came there. Administrator Green.
Thank you. And thank you, Lindy, for putting these two together. I think it does highlight just how, like you said, complex this process is. As somebody who does local, state, and federal grants, there's not an easy way. I will say I would support one mini grant application opening at the same time as the larger grant. So whoever is having to do this, it's all done at one time. I would also suggest a 3-year grant cycle. I hadn't thought about the applicant being able to choose a 1 or 3, so I do like that idea. But there is a lot that goes into this, and I think 4 months, that's a nice number. Mine are usually more of a 6 month from, yeah, I was like, that's really nice of you. But I think 6 months is, from what I've had to experience of doing them, is more realistic from the time it opens to the time the money actually gets awarded. But keeping it as simple as we can, if applications for both the mini grant and the longer grant or the bigger grant, however you want to word it, is all at the same time, I think would keep things even more simple. But thank you.
Dr. Nettleton, King, and then Dr. Nettleton.
So going back to the trust-based reporting, I think is critical, because when you start doing data-based reporting, it's about success, and we're talking about substance use and recovery. And I think that that's where, you can't say, what does success look like? If you look at a lot of rehabs, their success is how many people completed rehab versus left AMA, but no follow-up afterwards. So I think that trust base is, what is the intent of the program trying to accomplish, and are they working at being able to do that?
Dr. Nettleton.
A comment and proposal. I guess I want to push back. I don't know what this concept of trust-based, it's very nebulous to me. And for me, I want to emphasize, impact and competence, and we need to be able to evaluate that. So however we do that, whatever metrics we choose, that I think should be our end goal. Access is good, but if access and quality aren't there, you're not going to get the impact that you want. And so it's finding that balance. So impact and competence. And then I like this idea of every 3 years large grant and an annual mini grant cycle. It seems like a reasonable, and then do it at the same time. It seems like a reasonable accommodation. It gives time for reflection. It gives time for evaluation. And also, typically when we're making change on a population level, it does take years for that to happen as well.
I'm going to go to Dr. Ford and then back to Administrator Green.
Yeah, having completed a 9-month grant, it just wasn't enough time. So I think even for the mini grants, we just consistently said, I wish we had a whole year to really get that last quarter of outcome improvement, et cetera. So, and one thing that came to mind, taking it back as far as a data perspective, when we were making the percentages, when you look at the table that you made for us for the priorities within Exhibit E, I'm wondering if we could kind of bridge this gap between trust-based philanthropy and getting some reliable data by saying, as a county, we're going to commit, data is one of the priority categories, evidence-based data collection and research, but put a small percentage of the original funding towards a county person that can assist organizations that get these grants in, and just limited reporting, so we at least have some outcome about how things went without putting the burden on the nonprofits or the people that apply, because that part, it can be hard. So I just the thought about our original percentages, and can we
to Administrator Green.
Thank you. I have a trust-based philanthropy relationship with Kalamazoo Community Foundation, and when they rolled that out, I was like, what is going on? I will say it's nice for my reporting, because it's much quicker. However, in the back of my head, the entire time I'm meeting with them, I'm thinking, they're not measuring anything. How can they say whether I've met the goals or not? And, for the next application period, how are they going to be able to, could they deny me based on something I've said, whereas there's no measures? And so maybe it's because I'm more data driven. All of my other grants are very data driven. Maybe there is a combo that we need to do of a little bit of conversation, but also some proof, some data. But while it makes it easier as the person having to report back, I just question, like, if somebody were to apply for a second or a third time, how do we come back and say, well, you didn't really meet your goals? What were you didn't really have too many outcomes because we allowed them to have more of a conversation. So I would just put that out there.
Okay, as we continue, I just want to draw our attention to time. We're nearing the last few minutes of our meeting. We do have another update, administrator. We want to touch on the draft as well. So we could keep our comments succinct and move us forward, Mr. Gladstone and Ms. King.
Thank you, Chair. So there's miles of information out there if you read up on it about trust-based philanthropy, and there are organizations doing it all around the country. So there's plenty of info about how that works. In the short version, it's just it doesn't stick you to the data piece where you have to say, how many Narcans did you hand out today? Okay, how many people came through your place? And it's all data, data, data. In recovery and in treatment, how do you measure happy? What color is happy? How much does happy weigh? But there are plenty of people who find contentment and a better quality of life in recovery. So I would say a combination thereof of some data points for the data people and some conversational points would be okay. What I don't want to see is a nonprofit organization being stuck with, here's a book of reporting you have to do. No, 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 nay, nay. So, and the other thing is more cycles generate more ideas. So I like the example too, because it's not one organization keep reapplying for these mini grants or whatever, but now maybe this one pops up and I've got a great idea and they can get into a mini grant cycle. Now that nonprofit pops a new idea into the cycle. So that's that. I think I've covered, whoops.
Thank you, Mr. Gladstone. Ms. King.
Real quick, with the trust base does not include data. I think that's a real important piece to it. Like we can tell you the number of people that we saw, the number of people we engaged with, how many syringes we gave out, how many we got, there's data involved in that, but it's not an outcome based. How many people did you see that ended up in recovery? So I think that there's that balance in there. What is the intent of the organization? What are they trying to do with this money in the grant? And is that what they accomplished? And being able to demonstrate that in their reporting.
Okay, I think I want to bring this portion of our dialogue to a close as we are. Administrative, well, so we have draft board report. We are not going to have much time to get in dialogue around that. So what I want to encourage us to do, we have an initial draft. I want you to take some more time and digest what has been gleaned so far and compiled by administrator. And as our homework, I want to be prepared for discussion at our next convening about any details that we see missing, any additional recommendations that need to be elevated, and maybe we'll probably have an update and we have additional discussion points we've had today. So maybe deputy administrator will provide, look at what you have, we'll get additional update out, and let's be prepared to prioritize a dialogue around that at our next meeting. So that brings us to item 6. I'm going to move us to 5 minutes administrative update on the opioid mini grant application.
Yes, and I will just be very quick. So this was prior to the grant closing. The mini grant application closed yesterday at 5 p.m. Early yesterday morning, I received a report from the Kalamazoo Community Foundation that they had received 12 applications so far. Again, that was ahead of the closing at 5 o'clock. I have not, and I think our internet went down in here, so that's great. But to my knowledge, before stepping into this meeting, I did not receive an update on if more came in. But at this point in time, we have 12, and we are following that timeline and that process as we thought we would be. So I will continue just to provide y'all an update, especially if I get an updated number, I'll be sure to share with the group. And that's all I have.
And I'll add to that, Mr. Gladstone. The Board of Commissioners is requested a number of bodies to be moved to the scoring committee. Will include Chair Ray. There were recommendations from other board members Is there a determination brought forward, elevated 3 other individuals with lived experience along with Chair Ray to participate in that scoring committee. So those individuals have been selected and agreed to participate? Okay, so thank you to that, Mr. Gladstone. Okay, I knew it was. I knew it. I did. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we had another robust dialogue today. Thank you much for that. Anything else for the good of our order?
Motion to close.
Oh, 3 minutes early, we're adjourned.